Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this virtual meeting of the Sentencing Commission. I want to express my sincere appreciation for everybody making themselves available. As you'll see when we get into the meeting and into the subject matter, I thought it was pretty critical that we have an initial meeting to talk about the avoided cost formula and the report that's due on August 1st. And I thought it was absolutely impossible to be able to have a thorough discussion on this subject and arrive at some competent suggestions and a competent report if we met on July 29th only. So we're going to focus this meeting strictly on that subject and focus our attention on this so that we can give Victoria and her staff some direction on how to proceed with the report that we hopefully will be able to review on July 29th. Please remember to state your name each time you speak so that we can record who is speaking. It's especially helpful in the virtual format and assists our staff in being able to transcribe the minutes. I want to express a sincere appreciation to Jason Rickman of the Supreme Court's IT department and to our executive director, Victoria. Last night, there was serious doubt as to whether we would have been able to proceed with this meeting from an IT standpoint. There's been a serious separation problem in our IT systems with EATS, and so through an amalgamation of processes, laptops, wires, etc., and some really skilled IT people, we're able to pull this meeting off. You'll notice this laptop here at the front of our desk here in Carson City in the court's library. That's being used to film the video of our meeting to the public through the Nevada Sentencing Commission's website. So fortunately, we will also be displaying this meeting live with the public, where we wouldn't have been able to do so without Jason and Victoria's competence, skill, and innovation. So I want to thank them for that. Let's do a roll call, Director, to see who's present.
Mr. Arascata?
Here.
Ms. Brady?
Here.
Chief Carpenter?
Here.
Director Daniels?
Here.
Chairman DeRico? Judge Freeman? Mr. Hicks?
Here.
Mr. Imlay?
Here.
Sheriff Logan?
Here.
Mr. Marsh?
Present.
Mr. McCormick?
Here.
Ms. Mull is excused. Dr. Neighbors is excused. Mr. Ponder? Dr. Salisbury?
Present.
Judge Villani?
Here.
Assemblyman Hambrick? Assemblywoman Wynn? Senator Cannizzaro? Senator Pickard? Vice Chair Callaway?
Present.
Chair Hardesty?
Present.
We have a quorum, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. There are two periods, as the Commission knows, for public comment, one at the beginning, of course, and one at the end. I think we have 7 or 8 public comment statements that have been submitted to the Commission. As a reminder to the Commission members and to the public, on March 22nd, 2020, the Governor issued Emergency Directive 006 in response to the COVID-19 crisis The emergency directive suspended certain requirements of the open meeting law. The manner in which public comment was handled at the meeting on April 29 will be handled today and is the result of staff working with the AG's office to ensure that this public body is in compliance with the open meeting law and the emergency directive. Staff has either emailed or will momentarily the public comment that has been received to this point for this meeting. I'll pause so that the commission can review the public comments that have been submitted. And while the commission is reading through those, staff will hold a sign up to communicate to the public that the commission is currently reading public comments silently. The purpose of the sign is also to communicate to the public which items are being reviewed by the commission. Within 2 working days, staff will post the public comment on the website of the Department of Sentencing Policy. I'll reconvene in several minutes when we're satisfied that the commission has reviewed the public comment. And then I'll close the agenda item on this and we'll proceed with the rest of the meeting. So if you all will check your email, hopefully you have received an email from staff showing the public comment received thus far.
Chairman Hardesty, this is John Arascata. I have yet to receive the email.
You should have it momentarily.
This is Hardesty. This is Keith Pickard. I have not yet received it either.
Okay, and thank you, Senator. We'll mark you present in the meeting.
And then I'll send it to you again, I'll send it to you again, Senator. I wasn't sure. I'll double check.
All right. Yeah, I've got 3 different emails it could go to, so I've been watching all 3.
Okay.
All right, it just landed. Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay.
No, you're good.
I'd like to reconvene the meeting, noting that Chairman DeRico is also present. And if we didn't note it officially, Senator Pickard is also present for the meeting today. As the screen showed earlier, the commission had received 8 public comments that were displayed and copies of which were sent to all of the commission members. Do any members of the commission require additional time to review the public comments? All right, hearing none, we'll proceed with agenda item number 3. And first, are there any edits, comments, or corrections to the minutes of April 13th, 2020? Would anyone care to make a motion with respect to those minutes?
This is Senator Pickard. I'll move to approve.
This is Chairman DeRico. I'll second.
Thank you. There's been a motion made to approve the April 13th minutes as presented. Any discussion? This is awkward, I know, but let's all exercise a voice vote. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Is anyone opposed? Is anyone opposed? Hearing none, they're approved. Now let's turn to the minutes of April 29th. Are there any edits, comments, or corrections with respect to the minutes of April 29th? Would anyone care to make a motion with respect to those minutes?
Senator Pickard, so moved.
Is there a second? Dr. Salisbury made a second. Any discussion? All in favor, please announce aye.
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 Is there any member of the commission that's opposed to the adoption of these minutes? All right, hearing none, those minutes are approved. Before I get into agenda item number 4, and particularly for the benefit of those who submitted public comment, and maybe for some of the commission members who may not know, the Pardons Board met on June 17th. Among other activities, one of the agenda items considered by the Pardons Board was the letter submitted with the recommendation of the Sentencing Commission on how to handle or a proposal to the governor for handling or commencing early the consideration of the structure contained in the early release statute for certain limited numbers of individuals. The Pardons Board was also updated on certain testing and the results of testing. And I realize we didn't call on you or notify you in advance, Director Daniels, but if you don't mind, for the benefit of the public and this commission, could you approximate the number of testing, because it was fairly substantial, and the number of inmate cases, which was fairly minor by number? Charles, do you have current information on that?
Good morning. For the record, this is Director Daniels, Nevada Department of Corrections. As of this date, we have tested 10,329 inmates out of a total of 12,368 inmates, which equates to roughly 83%. Of that, we've had 9 inmates test positive for 0.81% of our inmates. I'm sorry, 0.08%, which is less than 1% of all of our inmates have tested positive. That is as of this morning. What other information would you like?
Thank you, Director. I appreciate that update. I just add to my report to the Commission that the Pardons Board made a request of Director Daniels, Chairman DeRico, and Chief Carpenter to determine whether or if there were inmates who might fall into the general category of people described in the statute that goes into effect July 1st, and if needed for purposes of COVID-19 CDC compliance requirements, those names be submitted to the Pardons Board for consideration of some potential early release. So that process has commenced. I'm not sure how many that might involve, but that information was requested by the governor as well as the Pardons Board, and I'm sure that the director and the chairman and the chief are looking at that issue as necessary. So we'll turn to agenda item number 4, and as you'll recall from our meeting on April 29th, Director Gonzalez provided an overview of the projected costs avoided report. We had so many other things going on in that meeting that I don't think we really gave this particular subject, which is pretty important from a statutory standpoint, the time that was needed. As you know, on or before August 1st of each even-numbered year, the Commission is required to prepare a report for the Governor and the Director of the Legislative Council Bureau for transmittal to the next regular session of the Legislature. I've asked Director Gonzalez to provide an overview of the calculation of projected costs avoided and an update on the status of the report. CJI is supporting the commission in developing the report, and Barbara Pierce is available here today to participate in our discussions. So Director Gonzalez, Ms. Pierce, if you all would proceed.
Thank you, Justice Hardesty. For the record, Victoria Gonzalez, Executive Director of the Nevada Department of Sentencing Policy. I'm going to get my PowerPoint shared here. And while I'm getting that set up, if you look at your materials, I've included a PowerPoint, the slides of the PowerPoint. I have also included copies of the statutes which I'll be referring to, if you would like those as reference as well. And then copies of the JFA inmate projection reports, which we've relied on as well. These are all, and then also the legislatively approved operation costs for NDOC from the last legislative session. All those are referenced for you. For those of you using Adobe, looking at a PDF, the table of contents, the table of contents is clickable. So if you scroll to the contents, it'll take you directly to the material you would like to look at if you're looking for quick access, because I know the materials are quite large. So if you're on PDF and you need a way to navigate that, you can click to the table of contents to navigate to the document. Move this around if I need. Okay, so NRS 176-01347, as enacted in AB 236, provides the statutory requirements concerning costs avoided. The statute provides that there are two deliverables that are required by this commission. The first is called the Statement of Amount of Costs Avoided. This is in subsections 1 and 2 of NRS 176-01347. This statement of amount of costs avoided is due December 1 of each fiscal year. For those of you referring to the statute that I provided, I have highlighted those subsections in yellow, important terms and dates. The second deliverable required by 176-01347 is the projected amount of costs avoided report. And that is mandated in subsections 3 and 4 of the statute. That report is due August 1 of each even numbered year. The sections I've highlighted in pink, for those of you referring to the NRS section, I am first going to briefly explain the statement of costs avoided. So that's the deliverable that's due December 1. But because the projected amounts of cost avoided report is due first in August, that's what we're here to talk about today. But I'll go over the statement of amount of costs avoided on the next slide. The statement of amount of costs avoided, the statute mandates that the commission will adopt a formula to calculate the amount of costs avoided. And the statute requires that the formula must include two things. The first thing is a comparison of the inmate projections created by the Office of Finance pursuant to NRS 176-0129. And the actual number of persons who are in a facility or institution of NDOC at the time that we do that. And we'll talk about that more. I recommend we address the statement of amount of costs avoided at the October meeting, as the projected amount of costs avoided is before us right now. However, understanding the statement amount of costs avoided provides a foundation for how we're going to approach the projected amount of costs avoided. I also want to mention that I am in regular communications with NDOC, and we are working on communicating monthly. And so based on those monthly meetings, as of May 31st, the total in-house population that I have is 12,406, and the in-house population is 11,937. Since I mentioned the actual numbers, I also wanted to mention that I'm in regular communication with NDOC regarding those numbers, so we can be on the same page with what these projections look like and what the actual inmate numbers look like. I wanted to explain how the inmate projections work, because the statute provides that this commission is supposed to rely on the projections required by the Governor's Office of Finance pursuant to 176-0129. So what that requires is that the Governor's Office of Finance contract for these inmate projections. Currently, that contract is with JFA Associates, and that contract requires 3 inmate projections per year as provided in the contract. I also wanted to point out that NRS 176-0139 requires the Governor's Office of Finance to provide this Sentencing Commission with inmate projections pursuant to NRS 176-0129 upon request. So that will help us facilitate these reports as well, but those projections are always available to this commission if they would like to request them from the Governor's Finance Office. So now I'll move on to why we're here today, but we will have to refer back to the statement of costs avoided. So why we're here today is to discuss the report of the projected amount of costs avoided, which is required by statute. The statutory requirements are these 3 things. The report is due August 1 of each even-numbered year. There are no statutory requirements regarding the formula for the projected amount of costs avoided. And the statute also requires there are statutorily required recommendations for reinvestment, which I will discuss later on in this presentation, but those are the 3 statutory requirements that we need to keep in mind for this report. As you recall, the Advisory Commission on the Administration of Justice initiated the Justice Reinvestment Initiative in 2018, which led to the enactment of AB 236 during the 2019 legislative session. The goals of the reforms in AB 236 include slowing the growth of the prison population, identifying savings realized due to the slowed growth, and then reinvesting those savings into programs and agencies to continue to slow the growth. We refer to those savings as costs avoided. In 2018, ACAJ identified potential costs avoided if certain reforms were adopted, which they were in AB 236. In consultation with CJI, we reviewed the methodology to inform the methodology to be used by this commission for the projected amount of costs avoided. So what I'd like to do is review the methodology, components of the methodology from 2018 to help this commission decide how it would like to move forward with the methodology for their report. In 2018, that methodology included using the August 2018 inmate projections required pursuant to NRS 176-0129. So that would be the JFA projections. And I provided that August 2018 report with your materials as reference. In 2018, the methodology also included a variable cost per prisoner in order to determine costs that would be avoided and costs that would be avoided. These variable costs include things such as medical costs, institution costs, remote camps, non-remote camps, and transitional housing. And you can see the correlating amounts to those from the legislatively approved costs that I provided for the upcoming session, because we'll be using a similar methodology as we move forward. So this is the 2018 methodology. So with that in mind, with CJI's help, we've put together a proposed methodology to calculate the projected amount of costs avoided for the 2020 report. What I have here is on the left side, the amount of costs avoided formula, which is the 2018 projections they're required pursuant to NRS 136-0129 and the actual number of persons in facility. I want to preface this proposal of the methodology I came up with in mind with the goals I have in mind. I want to assist this commission in providing reliable and sustainable recommendations. This methodology was designed with what is reliable and what will be sustainable over time. Like I said, the statute does not mandate what the methodology should be for the projected amount of costs avoided. But with the context of the costs avoided, we can use that as a basis. My proposal is that because projected modifies a term, so cost avoided is, within the context of the statute, cost avoided is defined as these 2 things on the left. I propose that projected modifies a term that's already established within the statute, and then we keep building on that to define projected cost avoided. So in consultation with CJI, I propose the commission use the formula for cost avoided as a basis to identify a formula for the projected cost avoided. So that would mean, if we look on the side here, that would mean we would use the 2018 inmate projections. We would look at the most current inmate projections. We would take the difference between the 2018 and the current projections and then multiply that by a variable cost per prisoner. My proposal for the variable cost per prisoner would be to use the most recent legislatively approved operating cost per inmate by institution. First of all, as I said, that it'd be sustainable. That's public information. We'd be able to access that from the previous legislative session. It would be reliable because we would always be able to go back to the same type of calculations instead of trying to come up with our own calculations each time. And again, I think we should use a similar approach with these variable costs. It would include medical, institutions, remote camps, non-remote camps, and transitional housing. So this is just another way to look at it. So what it would look like is we would take the fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23 projections from 2018. We would subtract the fiscal year 22 projections and the fiscal year 23 projections from the most current JFA projections, which is the February 20, oops, that's a typo. The February 2020 projections, which I've included that report with your materials. And then we would multiply that by the variable cost per prisoner as I've identified on the previous slide. So if we do that, here are the calculations we would have of costs avoided. Based on the projections we identified from JFA. So you can see what the projections were in 2018. So what they do for each of these reports is they do a 10-year projection of what they think the inmate population is going to do over time. And then so we would take what they predicted in 18 would happen in 22 and 23. And then we take what they've predicted in 20 will happen in 22 and 23. So what you will note is there's been a dramatic decrease in the population. JFA's report identifies possible explanations for this. One of the things that they've identified in their most recent report, in the February 2020 report, is that there were lower intakes. They also noted that there were increased releases to parole. And what is important to note, too, is with JFA's most recent projections, they took into account the enactment of AB 236. So with these 22 and 23 projections, these do account for what those reforms of AB 236 might look like. We will know more as we track these over time, as we get regular projections from JFA, but that is where they're starting from, and they've explained their methodology in their report, and they've identified exactly which, for those of you that have reviewed the report, they've identified exactly which reforms they've applied their calculations that they can use in their model. What I'll also note is that JFA has identified in their most current projections what they've called the baseline and a worst case scenario. So what that means is because there was such a dramatic decrease in intakes, they aren't sure if this is a trend or if there will be a surge and the intakes will dramatically increase. So the baseline assumes the trend will continue based on the decreased intakes. The worst case assumes that there will be a dramatic surge because there was that dramatic decrease that assumes that there might be a dramatic surge and the intakes will increase. And then we've taken then we can see the amounts down here would be based on the variable costs that I've identified from the legislative approved cost per inmate, multiplied that by the difference. And again, this is the CJI's help. Note that these are the totals that would be identified for costs avoided. And something like this could be put into the report with a more, as much detail as we want of the explanation I just gave. So at this point, I would be happy to answer any questions.
I have one, if I may.
Please.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. Going back to that last slide, I understand the theory behind a worst case versus the expected projection, but there was no difference. Does that mean that they've hit it on the head and there's no chance of a worst case deviating from the expectation?
All right, let's see. if that was the 2018, let me share this. So for the first line is the 2018 report. So in 2018, they did not have a baseline and worst case scenario. It was only in the 2020 report that they identified the potential for a baseline and a worst case scenario because of the dramatic decrease in intakes. So the reason that first line, there isn't a change in the baseline and the worst case is because they didn't have that scenario in 2018, but we wanted to make sure that the chart was complete. And so for the 2020 line, you can see those are the most recent projections, and they've identified the baseline and the worst case scenario. Does that make sense, Senator?
Yes, no, I can see that in the numbers, but I'm looking at the costs and the projections. Oh, well, I do see, sorry, I missed that there is a substantial bottom line difference. So never mind, I just apparently didn't make the trip all the way to the bottom.
No, thank you. I appreciate that because I want to make sure I can explain what this says. So I appreciate all of us looking at this and making sure we understand it together.
Why don't you, Victoria, explain what the bottom line means and how it was calculated? We didn't quite get that computation.
Of course, for the record, Victoria Gonzalez, of course, Justice Hardesty. So that bottom line then is based on the formula I presented. We took the difference between the projections from 2020 and 2018. And so that means the difference, if we look at, would be that third line, would be, let's go to 2022. The baseline difference would be 1392, and the baseline difference, the worst case scenario difference was 1024. So I'll just focus on that first 2022 baseline difference. That would be the 1392. So then if I keep going, working my way down the chart, I've got what we identified from the legislatively approved operating costs and included the medical costs and the different housing costs and institution costs. So it took that amount and then multiplied that by the 1,392, and that's how I end up with the calculation at the bottom of the 28,914,832.
And so that number is what we would be communicating as a projected cost avoided using this methodology.
Correct.
Legislature for their consideration.
Correct.
I realize that this may be modified as we get into the December 1 report, but this would be the communication to the legislature for their evaluation of this situation in 2020.
Correct.
2021.
Yeah, the next session. Yes, so correct. For the record, Victoria Gonzalez, that's correct, Chair Hardesty. So what we would do is identify for each of those numbers. So if we just take the 28 million, that would be then, and all of this would be explained in the report and identify the amount. And then what we'll discuss later are the statutorily recommended or the statutorily provided recommendations. So we would identify this potential savings, not only because of the enactment of AB 236, but also because of just changes in the state in general, and recommend that these savings we recommend to the legislature in the report that these savings be reinvested in programs and agencies that would continue to reduce recidivism and lower and continue to slow the growth of the prison population. And so we'd identify that in the report after we've identified the amounts and the methodology of how we got here. Then the commission would then identify what possible reinvestment could be done with those costs that were avoided.
If we could also, just for purposes of the record, under agenda item 4C, the JFA associate reports for 2018, as well as the projections for 2020 are set out along with their discussions. And I realize that this was disseminated to the commission, I think yesterday or the day before, So understandably, people may not have had a chance to spend a lot of time with these reports, but they are a critical component to our discussion. So again, I'm referencing agenda item 4C in your materials. That's the report, the 10-year prison population projection from GFA for August 2018. And then under agenda item 4D is the projection report for February 2020. It's that report, the one under 4D, that I think people will want to spend some time with, looking at the assumptions that were employed by JFA in reference to the enactment of AB 236. I know that some would point to other factors which are also mentioned in that report as contributing to a decline in the prison population, but they have also referenced 236. So the reason that I call this to your attention, especially since you may not have had a lot of time to address this, is if any of the members of the commission have questions or suggestions or would like to get further information about these two reports, please communicate that through an email to the director, and she'll do her best to get back to you to respond to your inquiry or your question. And because this information and these assumptions are going to be documented in our report to the legislature that's due on the 1st of August. Now, were there any other questions of the director about the methodology, the presentation? Yes, Chief Carpenter.
Hi, good morning. Ann Carpenter for the record. Just looking at the calculations, I guess my question is, when we're looking at costs avoided and trying to reinvest, possibly reinvest that money in the future, are we looking at possibly shutting parts of NDOC down to realize that that cost savings, or are we just simply looking at the cost per inmate and getting them released?
For the record, Victoria Gonzalez. Also, I'd like to note that Senator Cannizzaro and Assemblyman Wynn have joined us. Thank you, Chief Carpenter. So each year, or each biennium, NDOC uses these projections to build their budget. And so not being right there when the statute was drafted and designed, I would speculate that that was the intent, was to rely on the budget building of NDOC to determine how they were evaluating their own costs. And so we're looking at the projections that NDOC relies on as well for their budget building, and then trying to identify impacts from policy changes based on those projections, and kind of tracking what budget building may or may not be going on with NDOC. So that's why I say that's the first thing I would say. Additionally, that's why I would like to point out that relying on the methodology that CGI has assisted with as well, but this is what ACAJ did, relying on the costs such as medical, institutions, and the remote camps, and those costs that I identified, those are costs that change with inmates. We did not choose costs that change with, that would affect like the actual facilities. So I don't know how those costs would affect NDOC as those costs change, but by relying on costs that NDOC is already using, those costs are tied specifically to inmate changes. I wouldn't be able to, I could consult with NDOC, I wouldn't be able to speak to then how does that trickle down and affect institutions, but that's exactly why those costs were chosen, is because it's specific to inmate changes and not necessarily to facilities.
Dr. Salisbury, did you have your hand up?
I did, thank you. This is Emily Salisbury for the record. So I just have a couple questions, and of course I haven't really had time to go through the JFA reports, but just coming back to slide 7 of your presentation of your PowerPoint, it indicates that in order to calculate the costs here avoided, that we would use, or you're proposing that we would use the actual number of persons in a facility or institution. And so, of course, knowing that that actual number and the population of inmates and of incarcerated people changes quite dramatically over time, I'm wondering, and I, again, haven't had a chance to look at the report, do you know what kind of methodology they use? Or my question would be, are they using something like a moving average, since that average fluctuates over time? Is it just do they even use an average? Is it only like on a certain date? This is the actual number of people who are incarcerated. I'll have questions about that moving forward, and understand that you may not be able to answer that today, but that's a major question that I have. And then one other question that I just would like to mention are the projected amount of costs avoided methodology in terms of the different, let me see what slide it was. Slide 6, the variable cost per prisoner. Are we wedded to only those costs, or is there an ability to have a discussion about additional costs that might be avoided?
For the record, Victoria Gonzalez. So to answer your first question regarding slide 7 and the actual number of inmates, that methodology will be addressed in October. So that methodology is specific to the costs avoided. So the question you bring up is exactly the type of discussion that I would expect from the commission to decide what formula they would like to adopt, because the statute specifically requires the commission to adopt a formula for the costs avoided. And the formula must include these things, but then ultimately the formula that this commission adopts would be up to this commission as long as it has those statutory requirements. So the issues you bring up, I would recommend be discussed when we get to that formula, because for the projected cost avoided, we're not looking at actual inmate numbers today. I provided those today as a snapshot, just so you knew, number one, that I'm communicating regularly with NDOC, and second, that that's the kind of thing we'd be looking at as a starting point for the discussion for the formula. And then to your second question about which costs, variable costs to include for the methodology, as I mentioned, this is a proposal, and so again would be for this commission to decide, but I can explain, as I explained to Chief Carpenter, my rationale for choosing those costs is because they were tied specifically to inmate changes. And so, and they're sustainable in that I can always go and look up the legislatively approved costs, operation costs from the previous session, and that will help provide reliability and sustainability in the future. So someday, if I'm not here or whoever I'm working with isn't here, that they could recreate my methodology instead of having to recreate some other calculations. And so that's the only thing I would advise, is that if whatever the commission does choose to add or take away from this methodology, to ensure that to promote the sustainability of these reforms, that methodology include reliable and sustainable data that anyone can access, and then recreate this methodology no matter what.
Wonderful, thank you.
Are there any other questions for the director regarding the proposed methodology and her presentation on this subject?
Hi, this is Director Daniels, Department of Corrections.
Hi, Director.
Hey, I had a couple of thoughts that I just want to put out there. I appreciate the work that has been done, and I recognize that the process will be streamlined even further as we're talking about cost avoidance. However, there's a couple of things that I don't see here, and I only had a moment to go through the document, but I think up to a much larger consideration. We have to look at how many facilities I have and then how many camps I have. Those have a higher impact than just counting for each individual inmate and whether or not the population is just upward or downward. I'd also look at how the staffing impacts us as it relates to either overcrowding a housing unit or taking a housing unit offline. those are significant considerations, which I think would actually override even the considerations we have as we're talking about each individual inmate and our inmate population projections. So I would like to be a part of that conversation. That information is relevant, and I would struggle by just using an inmate population trajectory as a primary calculus for our ability to save money. That's all I have for the record.
For the record, Victoria Gonzalez, thank you, Director. That's exactly the type of input that I appreciate hearing too. I'm very new to this as well, and I appreciate the insight that each member of this commission has, which is why the commission is composed the way it is. And it's easy, I think, for a lot of us to be in different places and look at a black and white report and think we could understand or make some sort of calculations. And so that's exactly why I appreciate that input. And that would be exactly what this commission could consider as the commission decides how it would like to move forward with this. Thank you.
Director, I wonder if I could pose a question to you, Ms. Justice Hardesty, on the point that you raise. And that would be to, if people can go back to, I think it's slide 9, where the calculations appear. And under that, those calculations where we're talking about projections, is it possible to separate the projections out between those that are in your camps and those that are in your institutions? And having done that, separate the costs for each. Because I think the point you make is a valid one and takes into account the physical structures of the physical presence of where people are being housed. Do you understand my question?
This is Director Daniels for the record. I do understand your question, and just so that I can repeat it back, you would like for me to break it down by individual facility. And if that is your question, yes, I think that would be appropriate. What would also be beneficial would be to, for instance, take a look at and I'm not recommending or suggesting it, but if I had the ability to either close sections of a facility or close a facility, that would have a much more substantial impact than just this cost per inmate. Those variables are substantial because it would have an impact on the amount of staff that I would have to either release to perform other duties and or minimize or greatly reduce overtime costs because we're spread very thin. So no, I think the essence of your question is right on, and I could certainly provide you with some data that would be indicative of what the changes would be and the impact if we're looking at staffing and individual theaters of operation.
Because I would assume, Director, this is Justice Hardesty again, that if we went by institution and by camp, the costs per each, the variable costs that we are using would change depending upon which institution or which camp we're focused on.
This is Director Daniels for the record. Sir, the response to that is absolutely. Obviously, it costs a lot more to run maximum or high security than it would medium or low security. So yes, that would matter.
I think the reason that as I thought about this methodology in this report and I'm glad you interjected your suggestion here or your question, the more I thought about this is that it seemed like we might skew the savings inappropriately by not taking into consideration those differences. The Ely, for example, is a fairly consistent, straightforward cost and population, where the camps and some of the others are going to fluctuate. So I think we need to be careful suggesting that there is a significant cost savings out of, for example, Ely, where I doubt that would be necessarily the case. So I think if commission members are amenable, I'd like to encourage the director and his staff to work with Director Gonzalez and CJI to modify this and be more specific with respect to the institutions and the costs, variable costs associated with each institution. Any other questions for either Director Daniels or Director Gonzalez with respect to this methodology question? We're not going to take a vote on this. People need to think about these matters and offer additional input for the director to consider with respect to the formulation of the report in July. We do need to have a cutoff date. So you can keep thinking about this and ruminating about it, but we need your input, I would say, no later than the second week of July for us to be able to get our draft ready for people to take a look at. And Director, if you and your staff could communicate with Director Gonzalez as soon as possible with regard to our conversation, that would be really helpful.
Director Daniels, for the record, absolutely. We'll be very happy to meet with Director Gonzalez.
Are there any other questions or comments or concerns that commissioners have, at least at this point?
I have a question, Your Honor.
Yes, go ahead.
Christine Jones-Brady for the record. Can we get another copy of the PowerPoint that's just the PowerPoint so that I can share that with key members of the AG's office?
Sure, of course.
As opposed to like the whole big PDF document with everything. Thank you.
Yeah, I will email, and I can email it out to everybody, but I'll email it right after the meeting.
Thank you.
I think Ms. Brady, I think you should make those AGs look at the whole thing. Don't let them just do piecemeal. If you want to read it, you got to read the whole thing. Okay, we'll get it to you. Any other questions or comments then from commissioners on this agenda item? All right, then let's, and by the way, because these numbers were placed on the screen, these are hypotheticals, these are calculations, and they require adjustment. So I don't want the commission, I know you won't, or the public, more importantly, to think that we're about to have a $60 million savings over the course of the biennium. That's not the case. That is something that is just a work in progress. So I don't want to have people have a inappropriate takeaway from discussing a hypothetical calculation. Okay, so let's move on, if we could, Victoria, with the next item concerning the statutory requirements related to recommendations.
So to that end of what Justice Hardesty was, for the record, Victoria Gonzalez, of what he was just talking about just that we're identifying generally some savings and then putting that into context, that's the next component that I wanted to mention in the statute, what's required for the report. So the statute requires that the report support the guiding principle. There's a guiding principle to the report, and it's provided in statute, and that states provide financial support to programs and services to address behavioral needs of persons involved in the criminal justice system to reduce recidivism. So again, I think that goes to the point of whatever amount that's identified, it's not really about the number, it's about that we're seeing changes in our criminal justice system, and with certain policies in mind, here's some ideas to see what the financial impact is of those changes and then reinvest them. And so the statute provides specific recommendations for this commission to consider, and I've broken them down here on this slide. The recommendations first include recommending reinvestment into NDOC programs, such as programs for reentry, vocational training and employment, educational programs, and transitional work programs. The statute also requires the commission to recommend investments into the Division of Parole and Probation, specifically for services for reentry and scientifically proven programs which reduce recidivism. The next required recommendation is reinvestment into behavioral health field response grant programs developed and implemented pursuant to NRS 289-675. Those are the programs that are established and developed by POST, which we've heard from Director Sherlock a couple of times about. And I think part of his request for subawards is going into establishing those programs. And so the recommendation here would to be recommend reinvestment into those programs. The other required recommendation is to the Housing Division in order to create or provide transitional housing. And the last required recommendation is to the Nevada Local Justice Reinvestment Coordinating Council, created by NRS 176-014, for the purpose of making grants to counties for programs and treatments that reduce recidivism. As this commission may recall, that coordinating council is housed in the commission, and it is incumbent upon me to get that coordinating council up and going. That's been hindered. The progress of that has been hindered with the pandemic. I'm hoping to make a little more progress by the next time I see you in July and have an update on exactly how we can get that up and going. But again, reinvestment would be recommended to be provided to that coordinating council to help the local counties, because the purpose of that council is to provide support and feedback from every county in this state. So what I also want to present next to this commission is what I propose as an outline of the report generally of how we'd organize the information. A lot of it would be what we talked about today, but in a report form. I have identified 5 possible sections for the report. The first would be a background section where I would provide a history of how we got here. So that'd be what ACAJ did in 2018, and specifically identify the methodology that was used in 2018, as we wanted to use that as to inform the commission moving forward. I would also identify the goals of justice reinvestment, which are to strengthen responses to behavioral health needs of offenders, focus prison resources on serious and violent offenders, improve efficiency and effectiveness of community supervision, minimize barriers to successful reentry, and ensure sustainability of reforms. This report would advance goal number five, which is to ensure the sustainability of these reforms. The second section would identify the statutory requirements, as I did for this commission today. I would include a section going over and explain the JFA projections, specifically because they are required for the costs avoided, and so we're relying on those projections. They were also used in 2018. I would go into whatever the commission decides for the variable cost per prisoner and explain that methodology for the costs that have been chosen to calculate and include. And then also put in the report the approved methodology for that this commission decides. The third section would include the calculation of cost avoided. It'd be very similar. The foundation would be the chart that I provided in the presentation today, where the calculations would be identified. I would include the baseline and the worst case scenario, because we've relied on the JFA inmate projections. And then I would provide the JFA context for decreases and any other context that this commission approves to be included in the report. The fourth section would be statutorily required recommendations, as I just identified on the previous slide. So I would identify that principle of reducing recidivism, and then I would identify the priorities for this commission that I just identified, and what the commission would like to do with those priorities. The fifth section would be an appendix. And I propose that we include copies of the relevant statutes, copy of the JFA projections, and copy of the legislatively approved cost per prisoner or any other data that this commission relies on to build its methodology. So again, as I said, this could promote sustainability and reliability for the data, and could be continued in the future. So I'll take now any questions about the report, the outline, or those recommendations.
Do any commissioners have any questions, comments, or recommendations regarding the outline of the report and the subsection content? Okay, as to this item, unless there are any questions or concerns, I would like to get a motion approving the outline of the report so that the director can rely on this as she has much to do over the course of the next month. So unless there are additional subsections or corrections or things you want taken out or added, I'd like to give her that authorization from the commission as a whole.
Keith Logan, for the record, I'd like to make a motion to accept that outline.
Thank you, Sheriff.
Rochelle Wynn, I'd second that.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Thank you very much. Any discussion on the motion? All right, all in favor, we'll do a roll call.
Mr. Arascata,
Yes.
Ms. Brady,
Yes.
Chief Carpenter,
Yes.
Director Daniels,
Yes.
Chairman DeRico,
Yes.
Mr.
Yes.
Hicks. Thank you. Mr. Hicks? Mr. Imlay?
Yes.
Sheriff Logan?
Yes.
Mr. Marsh?
Yes.
Mr. McCormick?
Yes.
Dr. Salisbury?
Yes.
Judge Villani?
Yes.
Assemblywoman Wynn?
Yes.
Senator Cannizzaro?
Yes.
Vice
Yes.
Chair Callaway?
Yes.
Chair Hardesty?
Yes, and I think Senator Pickard.
Oh, Senator Pickard, I apologize.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Director, and thanks to the Commission for your review. I've had the good fortune of working with Ms. Gonzalez. We get weekly updates on the work of her staff, and I can't begin to thank she and Ms. Glick enough for their work. And as you can see from this, a lot of time has been spent preparing for the obligations that the statute has imposed on the Commission. I'll move to agenda item number 5, and I would like to ask Ms. Straight if she's available, or Barbara, to give a quick update on the status of the Bureau of Justice Assistance review of our subaward applications.
Thank you, Justice Hardesty. Let me put my Great. Can everyone see my PowerPoint slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. For the record, this is Abigail Straight from CJI. As Justice Hardesty said, I have a quick update for the Commission on the subaward funding application to the Bureau of Justice Assistance. As a reminder, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, or BJA, provides an opportunity for states that have recently passed justice reinvestment legislation to apply for funds to support implementation of the policies. Through BJA, any agency involved in implementing AB 236 is eligible to apply for subaward funding, and agencies can use these funds to help offset initial implementation costs and support sustainability. As we mentioned previously, BJA made a total of $428,000 in subaward funding available to Nevada. And at the last meeting, the Sentencing Commission reviewed applications from these agencies for these funds. As a reminder, on the slide here is what the Sentencing Commission approved to be included in Nevada's subaward application to BJA. Just to review quickly, Department of Corrections requested funds for 2 positions. Parole and Probation requested funds for training and for assessment tracking enhancements. And the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training requested a training specialist position. One quick note about this, MTP's original request for enhancements to the risk assessment tracking was for $39,142.84. This figure was based on a quote from EATS. However, NPP recently decided to use an in-house staff person to complete those enhancements instead. And as their staff were looking more into the best way to track risk assessments and share that information with NDOC, they decided that it would be able to do this in a more simple way than what EATS had originally proposed, but which would still get them the end result that they were looking for. Due to that, they decided to modify the funds requested for that service to $730.80, as you'll see on this slide. So you'll see that amount requested by MPP in this chart, and thus the total amount of approved requests across all three agencies is lower than the discussed at the April 29th meeting. Since that April 29th meeting, CJ has submitted these approved requests in an application to BJA, and we'll let the commission know when we hear back from BJA about this application.
Thank you, Ms. Strait. Are there any?
Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
One final slide. Sorry, almost finished.
Go ahead. Take your time.
As I mentioned, BJ allocated a total of $428,000 to Nevada for subaward funding. As you saw on the last slide, $298,500.88 of that funding has been approved by the commission and submitted to BJA. As I just mentioned, we submitted this to the BJA for approval, and we'll let you all know when we hear back from them. If BJA approves that amount, there will be $129,499.12 remaining in subaward funding that Nevada could apply for. And just one final note is that at the April 29th meeting, the commission also heard a fourth request for an application from the Washoe County DA's office. They requested $57,760 for an AB 236 implementation coordinator. If both the Sentencing Commission and BJA approved this amount, at the next meeting, there would be $71,739.12 remaining to be allocated. I know that's a lot of numbers. This is hard to see indicated. That's the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to hear them.
Are there any questions for Ms. Strait at this point? So as to we did move the request from the Washoe County District Attorney's Office forward, and I would like to include that on our agenda for July 29. My understanding, Mr. Hicks, if you're still with us, if not, I'll have Executive Director reach out to your office. But I recall that there were going to be a couple of modifications made as a result of our conversations during the consideration of that subaward request. So if possible, before the 29th of July, if your office could submit the amended request based on those conversations, then we could get to that request by the end of the month.
Yes, just as hard to stay. I am still here. Sorry, I stepped away for a second. I think I missed a vote, but I apologize for that. I believe we've already submitted that to Director Gonzalez, but if we haven't yet, I will make certain that it's there in time.
Oh, goodness. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. Chris, we'll get that on the next agenda to take up since we have those additional funds available.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Ms. Strait? In view of the fact that we have additional funding available to us, I've asked the Executive Director to recirculate a request to stakeholders to submit additional requests either by July 29 or by October 1, our October meeting, so that we can consider additional requests that people may not have submitted before, including existing agencies such as NDOC or NPP or whomever. Because there may be some things that develop or have developed since the initial subaward requests were made. So Chief Carpenter or Director Daniels, if you have additional areas that you would want to look into, please submit those. And if you're able to do that even before the 29th of July, that's fine too. But I just want to make sure that we take advantage of this opportunity moving forward. Okay, unless there's anything else on agenda item 5, let me move to agenda item 6. If anyone would like to comment on potential topics for future meetings, they can do so now. I'll invite that. That doesn't mean that you can't continue between now and our next meeting or in the future to submit suggested topics to the director. Let me just tell you though, for scheduling, in my view, we have a lot to accomplish at the July meeting, so I intend to keep our focus on this to get our work done by that deadline. So I probably will not place any other items on that agenda unless it's an emergency. And the October meeting will also require our attention on recommendation issues that the director has outlined and more specific information about our budget. The one thing that I would request the director to place on the July agenda, though, is the status of our own agency budget. I think that the Nevada Sentencing Policy Department is in real bad shape from a budget standpoint. When you compare the positions that were allocated by the legislature to, for example, the Indigent Defense Commission, where they have a director and secretary and a bunch of lawyers and the like, and we've got Victoria and Sherry. And given the demands and the responsibilities of the sentencing policy, and we're not even, we got a hiring freeze on the other lawyer that was allocated, so we can't even hire that lawyer. We need to get some relief here if we're going to place such demands legislatively on this department and have any reasonable expectation that a competent work product can be generated. So our budget requests are due by the end of July, or at least shortly thereafter. So I want to be able to have the commission entertain some suggestions on that topic from the director and from me for us to evaluate and pass on to the legislature. Any other topics that people would like to have placed on our pending list? And as I said before, you're welcome to submit an email with a topic to myself or to the director or both of us after this meeting at any time, as long as the commission is meeting. Anybody want to raise anything today? All right, hearing none, then we'll go to agenda item number 7, which is the second period for public comment. And we'll ask the director and Ms. Glick if they have received any public comment for dissemination to the members of the commission. We'll use the same practice as we did at the beginning of the meeting. We'll post on the screen any public comment by name, and within 2 working days of the meeting, the actual public comments that were received will be posted on the Department of Sentencing Policy website. Ms. Glick will send us an email if she has received any public comment during the meeting.
For the record, Victoria Gonzalez. Yes, so the commission should have items 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. Those are the remaining public comments.
Do any of the commission members need additional time to review the public comments? I do want to note for the record that there are attachments, as you see, with respect to public comment number 9 from Patricia Atkinson, as well as public comment number 10 from Josephine Liu, and public comment 11 also from Patricia Atkinson, and public comment number 12 from Tonya Brown. Those attachments will be posted on the website with the public comment, and they are also available for the members of the commission to access following this meeting once posted on our website. Are there any other, does anybody need additional time to review public comments through public comment number 13? Okay, seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Is Senator Pickard so moved?
Second.
A second by Mr. Arascata. So folks, unlike our previous 2 meetings, we are an hour and 25 minutes into the mission. Thank you all for your courtesy and your patience today. All in favor of adjournment, please say aye.